Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome back for today's lecture for Wednesday, April 22nd. Yesterday, we talked about the Berlin airlift, and before that, NATO and the Warsaw Pact. And uh, today, we're going to continue on with the idea of containment or the attempt of containment. There's some successes with containment. There was a stopping of communism in Japan, um, and stopping of communism from spreading into like West Germany. A failure of containment would be China. China fell victim to communist uprising. Now, China's history is just so complicated. I mean, the people there have had it rough for a while. So in World War II, China's just decimated by the Japanese. Like they're treated horribly. They're never actually in war. Like they don't have a federal government and they don't have much of a military, and they're just decimated by the Japanese. And I always say communism comes out of desperate times. No one resorts to communism when things are going okay. So China's really down, and when Japan surrenders in World War II, then now China is free. Basically, they are free to pursue their own government and their own leaders, and there's a power struggle. Zhang Jieshi was a member of a group that was known as the Kuomintang. They were a democratic and capitalist group that was trying to lead China, and then Mao Zedong, who was a follower of Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin, probably the two most influential people in communism. He leads his group against the Kuomintang, and the Kuomintang was uh, backed by the American government. You're going to see that America doesn't really care what kind of government or leader you are, as long as you're not communist during this time. Because the Kuomintang was not like free and happy. Like the people didn't like Zhang. They didn't like the Kuomintang in China. They were oppressive. They were corrupt. They were, you know, probably going to be led in some form of dictatorship. Most of the citizens of China supported Mao Zedong and the Communist Party. But the U.S. still kind of backed Kuomintang. They didn't send like many soldiers. They sent some money and some weapons, but the Communist Party of China prevails, and now Mao Zedong becomes leader of China. As we go on, we'll talk some more about Mao Zedong because he's a fascinating person. He's kind of hard to pin down as like what type of leader he was, and he's controversial because it depends kind of on who you ask. But 2 months later, after he consolidates power and he becomes communist leader, he called himself Chairman Mao. 2 months later, he travels to the Soviet Union and he signs a treaty of friendship, alliance, and mutual assistance with the Soviet Union. And that scares the daylights out of the U.S. Now it's two big, powerful countries that are now enemies of the U.S. Now, within the next 10 years, relations between Mao and Stalin are going to go south. They're not going to remain very close allies for very long. But for right this moment, China is now communist. And Mao Zedong, like I said, he's controversial. Like he built China into a very powerful country economically. Like they're the world power in terms of economics today, and Mao Zedong is the one that got it started. And people, when any kind of person that's sympathetic to communism or maybe even likes communism, they always point to, well, China's communist and they're doing fine. When this started, they were communist. Today, they claim to be communist, but I could look at their economy, and in a lot of ways, they're more capitalist than the U.S. They have a lot of capitalist tendencies. First of all, they are huge distributors. They're huge in selling goods around the world. Communism doesn't support exports. Communism does not believe in selling your goods to other countries and trading. Also, you're supposed to be all equal in communism. China has classes. China has wealth distribute, like unequal wealth distribution. They're communism by name, not by act today. So keep that in mind if anyone ever tries to say communism works because China's successful. No. But Mao does things like he supports women's rights, and like I said, he builds up their economy and their trade relations. But at the same time, he was very oppressive. He executed a ton of people, millions, for being anti-communist. He even ordered the explosion of a river dam, a huge river dam in China. He ordered for it to be exploded because on the other side of the dam was like basically this massive shanty town where a bunch of farming peasants had lived. He ordered the destruction of the dam so that way it would flood and kill all those people. He killed probably 2 million people by that flood. And it was his way of trimming the fat or cutting off the bottom. So he was controversial. But China is now communist, and this goes back to domino theory. It's only a matter of time before someone else falls or attempts to. Now, Korea was another Japanese territory, whereas I guess China wasn't a Japanese territory. China's been a country and an independent country for a long time, but they were weak for a short period, and then Japan saw an opportunity to go in and start influencing them. Korea, on the other hand, was an actual Japanese territory. And after World War II, as a part of their peace, or as a part of their, surrender, they lost Korea, and Korea becomes an independent country. But the U.S. and the Soviet Union decide, well, we're going to split Korea basically in half. They divided at the place that was known as the 38th parallel, which if you've seen a map or a globe, there are latitude and longitude lines, right? Hopefully you've heard of latitude and longitude. Latitude lines are like a ladder. They go side to side like this line right here, but it measures their degree from the equator, so it goes up and down. So they divided the 38th parallel, which is pretty close to right down the middle of Korea. And North Korea is going to be influenced by the Soviet Union, and South Korea is going to be influenced by the U.S. So, guess what their economies are going to look like? North Korea is going to be communist, South Korea is going to be capitalist. And no one in Korea really likes this. Koreans want to be unified, but they want to be unified under their type of government. Like South Koreans wanted the South Korean leader, his name was Syngman Rhee. They wanted Syngman Rhee to be the leader of unified Korea, and they wanted unified Korea to be capitalist. North Korea was led by Kim Il Sung, which I believe is now the great grandfather of the current North Korean leader, Kim Jong. Oh shoot, is it Kim Jong Un now? Yeah, I think it's Un. Kim Jong Un. But his grandfather Kim Il Sung, or great grandfather, was the leader of North Korea, and North Koreans wanted the unified country of Korea to be ruled by Kim Il Sung, and they wanted the whole country to be communist. So they tried to coexist, but on June 25th, 1950, North Korea invades South Korea. And this is a direct threat. So the U.S. joins in as, part of containment is going to be stopping any kind of spread of communism. That's what this appeared to be. So U.S. forces assist South Korean forces, and North Korea, this war's back and forth. North Korean forces get pretty deep into South Korea, and they can't really repel the North Koreans. So the U.S. plans an amphibious attack where they go by water and they start to try and surround the North Koreans. And they entrap them. Or they try and entrap them. North Koreans are able to escape, and they escape back into North Korea. But American and South Korean forces decide not to leave it at that. They see North Korea on the run. They decide to pursue. Maybe this would be their chance to unify the country under a capitalist government. So they move into North Korea, and they get almost all the way to the Chinese border, which is this border up here. And when they get close, China sees that as a threat to them because they think America's using this as an excuse to invade China. And so Chinese forces jump in. So now you got North Korea, you got the US and South Korea versus North Korea, the Soviet Union, and now China decides to get in. And they counter invade, and they repel American and South Korean forces back past the 38th parallel. And then the war just turns into a standstill. It turns into basically another rendition of trench warfare from World War I. It's just a war of attrition, where nothing's really being accomplished, but people are dying. And the U.S. and South Korea had way better air attacks. They bombed North Korea a ton. And then North Korea would move in and burn down Seoul and Panmunjom and Incheon, South Korean cities. And so basically, really any major city in either Korea gets destroyed during this time. To illustrate the damage done, North Korea had more bombs dropped on it than any city or any country in World War II. They got carpet bombed, basically. Now they get outdone by Vietnam here in a couple of years. Vietnam and Cambodia get absolutely destroyed by bomber raids. But at the time being, Korea got bombed like no country we'd ever seen up to that point. But finally, after a while, we decide, all right, we've we've got to agree to stop fighting, and so ceasefire is agreed, which just means stop fighting while we try and negotiate a treaty. Now, a treaty is never signed. Nothing could ever be agreed upon. Fighting doesn't resume, but a treaty's never signed. So to this day, South Korea and North Korea are technically still at war. Now, they haven't fought physically since the Korean War, so it's been 67 years, but they never signed a treaty. It wasn't until 2 years ago the two leaders of the two countries decided to meet and talk about possibly signing a treaty, but that still hasn't happened yet. There's on this 38th parallel, there's what's known as a demilitarized zone. I think it's like 20 miles on either side of the line where no military forces from either side are allowed to get within the 20 miles or something. And that was agreed to try and like cease hostilities. Interesting story during this time. Not really this time, actually, about 20 years later in the 70s, in Panmunjom, the city here that's in the demilitarized zone, both militaries are like on the lookout. Like with binoculars, they're looking across the border and just keeping an eye on each other. Well, just outside Panmunjom, like right on a line, there's this tree, this big tree, and it's obstructing South Korean and American view to see the North Koreans. Now, that tree is very important to North Korea because it was said to be planted by Kim Il Sung and nourished by Kim Il Sung. It's a big tree, and it's supposed to be symbolic of his power and his strength. Well, American and South Korean forces want to cut it down because it's in their way. And so they go to cut it down, and North Korean forces freak out. And they're like, no, you're not doing that. They threaten to fight. Well, American and South Korean forces aren't prepared to fight at that time, so they leave. And 3 days later, they bring a couple more, and they just start cutting the tree down, and with an axe or with a saw. And North Korean forces don't take kindly to that, tell them to stop, and then they keep going. They don't stop, and so North Korean forces decide to attack these like 10 American South Koreans, and it can't be seen by anybody on the lookout on the South Korean side because there's a bunch of hills and there's grasses and you can't see specifically where that tree is. So nothing is set off. But there's guys watching, and they see up in land a little bit above, more high ground, something suspicious. They see North Korean soldiers walking in and out with a bloody axe and like handing it to another soldier, and then that soldier walks down and disappears. And a couple minutes later, he'll walk back and hand the axe to another guy, and that guy will walk and disappear. And turns out that the North Korean soldiers took those axes and murdered the tree cutters. A couple Americans involved. So this sets off alarms in South Korea and America, really makes the president at the time, Gerald Ford, very angry. And they decide to send a huge force to Panmunjom to cut the tree down. So if you want to fight, we'll fight. And so they send this force, and the North Koreans send a force, and there's basically a standoff. But the American and South Korean force is so big and strong, it intimidates North Koreans, and they just have to sit there and watch the tree get cut down. Now, the funny part of that story is they don't cut down the tree at its base. They cut it down about 6 feet tall and leave it just look, it's a 6 foot tall stump and it looks kind of pathetic and frail. But they left it that way so they could show it as a sign of, this is what your strength has become. This frail, now 30 years later, rotted out carcass of a tree. So it's a crazy story. It's known as the Panmunjom axe murderer incident. It was pretty crazy. Nearly started World War III right there, all because of trying to cut a tree down. Now we get to DNB and Phu. I'll try and tell this quickly. Southeast Asia, these countries here, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, they're here just southeast of China. A small group of countries. They were previously French colonies. This was known as French Indochina. Well, France is kind of weak after World War II, and they're dealing with some communist uprisings in Vietnam. And Dien Bien Phu was a major city in Vietnam, and it's like the first to be liberated, as they called it, in Vietnam by a man named Ho Chi Minh, who was a communist. And this map I use actually, it says 1992. I could see that. That city was previously, I believe, Saigon. Now, Ho Chi Minh City is what it becomes named after. But this isn't the Vietnam War. This is just the creation of Vietnam. They defeat the French by guerrilla warfare, and the French agree to leave Vietnam if they decide to split Vietnam in half. They say North Vietnam can be communist, but South Vietnam doesn't want to be communist, so you need to allow them to be, capitalist and free in that sense. So we create North Vietnam and South Vietnam. And the U.S. now becomes, the protectorate of South Vietnam. Now, if you know anything about history, that's not going to hold up. Here before long, North Vietnam is going to invade South Vietnam. But the fall of Dien Bien Phu was the start of communism in Vietnam, and another domino to fall. And it's just going to keep spreading. That happens in 1956, I think. So at this point in our notes, Vietnam is split in half, North Vietnam, South Vietnam. But we're going to hear a lot more about Vietnam in the coming days. So now our essential question. In the Korean War, what countries supported North Korea and what country supported South Korea? You should have two countries that support North Korea and then one that supports South Korea. Real simple. So I mentioned both of them, and you should probably have a clue based on, previous notes. So that's it for today. We'll stop there. Got a couple weeks left. We're coming down the home stretch. We're getting close. Stay focused, stay engaged, stay productive. Do all your classwork. Stay disciplined. These are tough, crazy times, but we've got to stay on the right path. So take care, guys. Have a good one.